So, this is me. I spent a lot of my time watching my favorite TV show, Grey's Anatomy, and I love meeting people just like me because we always bond about how great Grey's Anatomy is. Me and my friends spend so many of our nights watching the best show to ever come on television. And no, for those of you still wondering, we're not over Derek dying. So every episode has a really great positive life message, and it's gotten us through some really tough times, like exam days or days where it was easier to pretend like we were surgical residents surrounded by gripping drama rather than stressed out college students. So suppose this is someone I met at school one day. They like to watch National Geographic. What a bore. And all their friends who spend their time watching documentaries. As you can imagine, our two groups tend to keep our distance. And although this seems like a silly metaphor, this is the reality of our world. We tend to form our communities based on people who are similar to us, people who have similar likes, dislikes, and values. And as you can see, this really creates a limitation in how inclusive our society can be. And it would be ridiculous to say that you would agree with every single person you meet, and just as unrealistic to say that the answer to having a more inclusive society is just by having people agree with each other. This is exactly how I grew up, except with my parents. So by raise of hands, how many of you guys were raised by strict parents? Wow, okay, so also keep them up if you're a first-generation born American. Okay, so a lot of you, okay. So for those of you who didn't raise their hand, imagine a situation where you're like bouncing between two inherently different cultures. That's like what it was for me growing up Indian American. I didn't really quite fit in the Indian mold, and I didn't really quite fit in the American mold. It's almost as if I was living two entirely different set of lives with two entirely different set of expectations. I was in one environment that was really positive and uplifting, and I was in another environment that was unfortunately sometimes very conservative and suppressing. I realized from an early age my parents and I would never see eye to eye on anything. They grew up in an environment where children and parents were taught to act and enforce a very conservative ideology, where the men were taught to be the bread makers and the women were taught to be docile, meek homemakers. And while they didn't enforce this ideology on me, they were surrounded in this seemingly extremely progressive environment, causing them to reject it. And for me, this led to a lot of isolation and disdain. And unfortunately, sometimes that disdain extended to my parents because it felt like I couldn't be who I wanted to be at home because they would never understand me. And it's like the scene in Cinderella, except this is how I felt every single day when I stepped outside the house. It was a chance for me to be who I always wanted to be. I could go out with my friends and hang out at the local mall or the local AMC and watch the newest movie coming out. And I had another life where I came home and put on a facade of being this good, conservative Indian female. And no, this isn't a sob story of just how strict my parents are. And contrary to my Cinderella analogy, I'm not saying my parents were the evil stepmother. They were doing everything right in their mind. They came to a foreign country where they had little to no idea of how life was going to be like, how they would make a living, or how they would raise their child. And the only way they can make it through these trying times was to hold on to their strong cultural roots, such as education and financial stability. But being surrounded in an environment that was completely different from their beliefs led them to reject it and led them to believe that the only way they can keep their children safe was to completely shelter them from it. But I was growing up in an environment totally different from them. And I was picking up American mannerisms and traditions. And all I ever wanted was for them to realize I was acting completely normal, just like how my neighbors were, just like how all my best friends were, and just like everyone around me was acting. So fast forward to college. As you can imagine, I went a little crazy, and who could blame me? I could finally do everything I always wanted to do. I could party all night and sleep all day. I could skip all my classes just to hang out with my friends instead. And I could finally do everything I always wanted to do. And who was going to stop me? The epitome of all this came to my diary. In that diary, I had written my best college experiences, from the first time I went to Reading Terminal, to my first party, my first boyfriend, and the time that me and my friends pulled an all-nighter for absolutely no other reason other than to watch movies all night because, hey, it's college and why not? But one day, I had a lapse of judgment, and I left that diary at home for just about anyone to come and read. That day, both of my worlds collided, and let me tell you, it was not pretty. That day, my parents picked up that diary. They read everything, and they were so disappointed. They realized that everything they had done up till this day hadn't worked, and everything they were trying so hard to shelter me from, I was doing. The day they realized that I was always going to be a green circle, and they were always going to be a purple circle. I was basically a foreigner to them. And I began to resent them, and even more so my culture, for making them think this way. They were trying to push upon me parts of my Indian culture that I was never going to accept. They were stuck in their own ways, and they would never understand me. But despite all the parts I did love about my culture, I eventually began to hate it, and even so more them for making them think this way. But just like how I couldn't become someone else, my parents at the age of 40 couldn't just abandon their values and pick up the progressive culture that I identified so much with. And during these trying times, I didn't really know what to do. And I looked outside in my circle, and with a lot of time and a lot of therapy, I figured out what was happening. I had to stop looking at my parents as a whole, but rather broken down by their values, like a pie chart, which helped me realize that my parents' values came from things like family, hard work, image, and education. And my values came from things like self-reliance, privacy, directness, and independence. But this also helped me realize that I was going against 50% of my parents' values, education and image, which was earth-shattering to them. And as we all know, 50% is a failing grade. So this made it really hard for us to understand each other. My parents and I were both trying to superimpose our values on each other. And as much as they wanted me to be like them, I wanted the same exact thing. I wanted them to realize I was being normal. This is something that happens to us every single day. When we interact with someone that we don't agree with, we naturally make it really hard to interact with them. But why is that? Why do we think that our pie chart of values is right and the person sitting across from us is wrong? My parents and I had a fallout, and I could have used this as an excuse to completely reject them and completely reject my culture. After all, they had done it to me, so why couldn't I? But tackling changing the thought process of my 40-year-old parents is not a single-minded job. My brother actually played a huge role in this, and it started with numerous long, tedious conversations and attempting to create an open channel of communication where I expressed how difficult it was to grow up living two different lives with two entirely different set of expectations, beliefs, and values. But trying to understand my parents gave me the perspective I realized that rejecting them was rejecting me because I was a product of both of my environments and both sets of values. My parents thought one way and I thought another way that didn't necessarily make them right and me wrong, or vice versa. I finally understood my parents, and I hope they do too. And don't get me wrong, the way the world is right now, we're constantly surrounded by so much conflict. And this isn't the fix-all for all the differences that divide us, but everyone has their own pie chart of beliefs. And this definitely doesn't excuse hatred, but understanding that everyone values different things is the first step from moving away from all the differences that divide us. And you might not necessarily agree with every single person that you meet. And this isn't going to fix all the differences, but recognizing each other's values can be used as a way to bringing us closer together, to understanding that each other's values and motivations for a more inclusive society. Because with a more inclusive society, we can start working with each other rather than against each other.